I grew up in a small town, the kind where everybody knows which families go to which church and what time the hardware store closes. My parents worked a lot. My dad drove long-haul routes and was gone more than he was home, and my mom held down two jobs for most of my childhood, so I spent huge stretches of my early years at my aunt's house. She was my mother's younger sister, and to the outside world, she was the fun one, the one who baked, the one who had time. She had no kids of her own. She'd had a marriage that ended quietly when I was too small to remember it, and after that she poured everything she had into being the best aunt anyone could ask for. That's how everyone described her. That's how I would have described her too, for most of my life. She used to say I was her girl. It started when I was 4 or 5, and everyone laughed about it because it was clearly a joke. She'd say it at birthday parties in front of my mother, "This one's mine. This is my girl. Aren't you my girl?" And I'd giggle because she was warm and she smelled like vanilla, and she was the adult who paid attention to me. When you're little, being someone's favorite is just sunlight. You don't examine it. I want to be clear about this because it's important later. Nobody, including my mother, thought anything of it. Families have their little running jokes. This was ours. What I remember from those early years, before anything strange, is that I was a quiet kid who liked quiet things. I liked organizing my aunt's button tin. I liked the texture of certain fabrics. I would run my thumb along the satin binding on an old blanket while watching television, and she noticed, the way she noticed everything about me. I liked when she braided my hair before it was cut short for school. None of this meant anything to me. I was a child. Children like soft things and pretty colors and being fussed over, and none of it is a statement about identity because a 6-year-old doesn't have the architecture for statements like that. I want to say that clearly, because one of the hardest lessons of my whole life has been learning to separate what I actually felt from what was built around me, and I'll be coming back to that idea over and over. When I was 7, my parents' marriage went through a bad stretch, and the arrangement at my aunt's house became semi-permanent. Weekdays were hers. Weekends sometimes were my parents'. And somewhere in that year, the game started. She called it dress up. She had boxes of clothes from her own younger days. She'd kept everything, which I later understood was unusual, and playing dress up after school became our ritual. She'd put me in one of her old dresses, do my hair, sometimes put a tiny bit of tinted lip balm on me, and we'd have tea at her kitchen table, and she'd tell me stories about when she was a girl. I want to tell you honestly, I loved it. I loved it the way you love any game where an adored adult is delighted with you. There was nothing in it, at 7 years old, that felt like gender. It felt like attention. It felt like being the center of someone's world. And here's the thing I need you to understand, because this is the part that makes the whole story complicated and human instead of simple and monstrous. As I got older, 8, 9, 10, some part of the dress-up started to feel different from pure play. There were moments, standing in front of her mirror, when I felt something settle in me, a kind of quiet rightness that I didn't have words for, and that I was also vaguely embarrassed by. I didn't tell anyone about that feeling, obviously. I barely admitted it to myself. But it was there, and it was mine, and I've had to fight to keep believing it was mine because of everything that came after. A real thread of something in me, some genuine curiosity about femininity, some genuine comfort in it, existed before anyone ever touched my body. That thread is the only part of the story I've never doubted. Everything built on top of it is another matter. When I was 11, the dress-up quietly stopped being a game I could opt out of. It didn't happen with a speech or a rule. It happened the way water erodes rock. The clothes she kept for me started being in my size, bought new, not hand-me-downs from her youth. There was a drawer, then a dresser. She started referring to my other self with a name. I'll call her the girl name she chose, a name I didn't pick, and even now I flinch a little hearing it in my head. She introduced subtle structure. On dress-up days, I'd be expected to come home, change, and stay changed until bedtime. Weekends I spent with her became weekends where I was the girl name from Friday night to Sunday afternoon. And I want to be honest again. I mostly went along with it. Partly because some piece of it still answered that quiet rightness in me. Partly because children are built to please the adults who raise them. And partly, and this took me years of therapy to admit, because the alternative was a lonely house and an empty afternoon, and she had made herself the sun in my sky. When the sun asks you to stand in a particular spot, you stand there. She was careful, always about secrecy. It was framed as our special thing, and the framing had an edge to it I didn't understand at the time. People wouldn't understand. Your father especially wouldn't understand. This is just ours. And children absorb that logic whole. I became a kid with a double life before I was 12, and I became good at it. Good at monitoring which version of me was present. Good at never slipping. Good at a low grade, constant vigilance that I now know is a form of chronic stress. I slept badly a lot of those years. I got stomach aches before family gatherings. I was, by every teacher's account, a polite, anxious, slightly absent boy. Nobody guessed anything because nothing visible was happening in public. That's the thing about this kind of secrecy. It doesn't look like anything from outside. It looks like a quiet kid and a devoted aunt. I was 12 when the vitamins started. She gave me little pills with breakfast on the mornings I was at her house, in a weekly organizer, and she said they were for my skin and my hair, that I'd been looking peaky, that her girl should glow. I took them the way you take anything a trusted adult hands you. I want to pause here and say something directly to anyone young who might be listening to this. No adult who loves you correctly will ever give you medication in secret or ask you to keep secrets from your parents about your body. That sentence, had anyone said it to me at 12, would have changed my entire life. Nobody said it, so I took the pills. The changes were slow enough that nobody clocked them as changes. My skin got softer and clearer, which I attributed to the vitamins working. The fuzz that should have come in on my face at 13, 14 mostly didn't. My body stayed narrow in some places and softened in others in ways that were just subtle enough to be explained away as a skinny kid, a late bloomer, and I was homeschooled for a stretch during an illness, which meant no locker rooms, no communal changing, none of the ordinary comparisons that would have rung alarms for me. My voice settled higher than most of the boys around me. Adults commented that I was delicate, pretty even, and my aunt would beam, and I would feel that complicated mixture, pleasure at being approved of, and a wrongness underneath it, like a note played slightly flat. I found out what the pills were when I was 15, and I found out by accident, which is somehow the detail that still stings, that I learned the truth about my own body as a side effect of her carelessness. She'd left the organizer on the counter with the original bottles in the cabinet above it, something she never did, and I was reaching for a glass, and one of the bottles came down with it. I read the label. I didn't fully understand the label, but I understood enough to type the words into a search engine on the family computer with my hand shaking, and I sat there in her kitchen reading about what those medications were, what they did, what they were for, who they were prescribed to, and by whom, and under what supervision. And I remember the room being completely silent, and my own heartbeat being the loudest thing in the world. I want to describe what that moment actually felt like, because people imagine discovery moments as cinematic, a surge of clarity, a dramatic revelation. It wasn't. It was more like the floor of my entire childhood silently dropping a few inches, everything still standing but nothing level anymore. Because the worst part wasn't the pills. The worst part was the rereading of my own life that began in that kitchen and didn't finish for years. Every memory got pulled out and held up to a new light. The girl name. The dresser of clothes bought in my size. The way she'd touch my hair and say it was getting so soft. The way she'd steered every conversation about my future, even innocent ones. What do you want to be when you grow up? Back toward her house, her plans, her girl. The vitamins for my skin. Her girl should glow. I sat there understanding that the body I lived in had been edited without my signature, and that the person who did it was the person I loved most in the world, and those two facts did not resolve into anything. They just sat side by side, both completely true, and I was 15. Here's what I did next, and I'm not proud of it, but it's the truth. I did nothing. For months. I kept taking them. She'd started watching me take them by then, not overtly, but she was always in the kitchen at breakfast, always, and I told myself a rotating series of stories. It's not really those pills. Maybe the label was old. It hasn't done that much. If I stop, she'll know I know, and then what? If I tell my mom, it will detonate the family, and my mom works 2 jobs and cries on Sundays already. And underneath all of those, the ugliest and most honest one, I was afraid that if I pulled this thread, I'd find out the whole sweater of my childhood was a lie, and I wasn't ready to be naked. Fear of the truth is one of the most powerful forces I've ever encountered, and it doesn't feel like fear. It feels like reasonableness. It feels like patience. It feels like loyalty. It's fear. What finally broke the stalemate was my own body, which is appropriate because it was my body that had been the subject of the whole secret. I started reading, really reading, obsessively in the way that 15-year-olds can, about what long-term use of those medications does at my age, about what was reversible and what might not be, about what medical supervision was supposed to look like, and how far outside of it I was. And I did something that, looking back, was the first genuinely adult act of my life. I made an appointment with a doctor. Not her doctor. A doctor in the next town over, at a clinic, using my own insurance card information which I copied from my mother's wallet, and I went alone on a Saturday, when I was supposed to be at a friend's house. I told that doctor everything, in a monotone, staring at a poster about hand washing, and when I finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and she said, very gently, "You did the right thing coming here. None of this was your fault, and we're going to get you real information about your own body." I cried in that exam room harder than I have ever cried before or since. I think I was crying for the 11-year-old with the pill organizer. I hadn't known I was carrying him around, but I had been. The tests came back over the following weeks, and I'll spare you the clinical details because they're mine, but the summary is this. The intervention had been real, sustained, and entirely outside any medical protocol. Some effects were likely to fade with time off the medication. Some might not fully. And the doctor explained something else, something that reframed everything. What had been done to me wasn't just inappropriate, it was reportable. She was a mandated reporter. There was no version of this that stayed between us. I remember feeling, bizarrely, apologetic, like I had tattled on my aunt, and the doctor saying, "She did this. You didn't do anything but survive it." I've thought about that sentence approximately 10,000 times since. The unraveling of the family happened over the next several months, and I'm not going to narrate it blow by blow, partly out of privacy and partly because it's the least instructive part of the story. It involved Child Protective Services, and my mother sitting at our kitchen table with her face in her hands, and my father punching a wall, the only violence I ever saw from him, and my aunt being confronted and saying things that the investigators recorded, things about how she'd always wanted a daughter, about how I was happier that way, about how she'd never hurt me, she loved me. And that last part is the part that took the longest to untangle, because it was true. She did love me. That's the whole tragedy of it. It wasn't love's absence that harmed me. It was love that had decided it owned the thing it loved. Love that thought my life was a story it was entitled to write. There are 100 cautionary tales in that sentence alone, and they apply far beyond my situation, to parents who live through their kids' achievements, to partners who sculpt each other, to anyone who is ever confused, "I want what's best for you," with, "I want you to be what I imagined." The legal and protective outcome was that contact was severed and my aunt entered the consequences of her choices, and I entered the system of aftermath. Therapy, medical follow-up, and a family that had to relearn how to look at me. The medical side, again briefly, I stopped the medication. My own development resumed in its own uneven way, and time did more repair than I dared hope, though not all of it. I live with some permanent echoes of those years.
I've made my peace with most of them.
Peace is different from amnesia. But the medical story was never the hard part, and this is where I want to slow down, because this is the part of the story that I think has real value for anyone listening, whatever your own history is. The hard part was the question underneath everything. Who am I, actually? Because here was the trap I was in. For years, my aunt had told me, through cloves, through a name, through pills, through her delight, that the girl version of me was my true self, the self she saw and loved. When I discovered the betrayal, the obvious move was to reject all of it wholesale. It was all her construction. None of it was me. Burn it down. And part of me wanted to do exactly that. But there was that thread I mentioned at the beginning, the quiet rightness in front of the mirror at 9 years old, before any pills, in the early innocent years of the game. Was that real? Was any of my comfort in femininity mine, or was all of it planted? And if I couldn't tell the difference, did I get to have an identity at all, or was I just a garden someone else had planted, free to salt the earth but not to grow anything of my own? I want to tell you that therapy resolved this neatly. It didn't. What therapy gave me, over years, was something better than resolution. It gave me a method. My therapist, the second one, the first one wanted to move faster than I could, taught me to stop asking which self is the real one, because that question assumes identity is a treasure buried somewhere that either you or someone else finds first. Identity doesn't work like that. It's not discovered, it's authored, slowly, by trial, by noticing what persists when nobody is watching and nobody is applauding. So she had me run experiments, small ones, completely private. Not about labels, about details. How do I feel with my hair long or short when no one sees it? What clothes do I reach for when there's zero social consequence either way? What name do I flinch from, and what name feels like a coat that fits? And the rule was that the experiments were mine alone. No audience, no approval, no ant-shaped ghost grading my performance. That rule mattered more than any single experiment because approval had been the original drug long before the pills. I had to learn what I felt like when I wasn't being delighted over. What I found over a few years of this quiet work was, inconveniently, honestly, not a simple answer. Some of what she dressed me in had never been mine, and letting it go felt like taking off a backpack I'd worn so long I'd forgotten it wasn't a body part. And some of it, some genuine ease and softer presentation, some real relationship to femininity that predated and survived everything, was mine, and discarding it just to spite her would have been letting her write my story all over again, just in reverse. That was the insight that took the longest to arrive, and now seems obvious. Refusing something just because she imposed it is still letting her choose. Freedom isn't the opposite of her script. Freedom is not consulting her script at all. So I built, slowly, a self that would have made no sense to anyone watching for a simple resolution. I present mostly masculine in daily life now. That's where I live most comfortably, and there are parts of my private life, my home life, my close relationships, where femininity shows up in ways that are quiet, unperformed, and entirely on my own terms. I use my own name, the one on my birth certificate, which I had to reclaim because for a while I hated it for not being the girl name and hated the girl name for existing. My body is mine now in a way it never was at 14. I know its medical history. I make its decisions. I read every label. And I've come to hold two things at once without needing them to fight. That I was harmed, seriously and deliberately, by someone who loved me, and that I am not broken. Those two facts coexist. Survivors are not either ruined or untouched. We're people who went through weather. I also want to say something about forgiveness, because people always ask. I have not forgiven my aunt, in the sense of reconciling or releasing her from accountability, and I've been at peace with that for years. Forgiveness is often sold as a gift you give yourself, and I think that framing pressures harmed people into performing closure on a schedule that suits everyone else's comfort. What I've reached instead is understanding. I understand, intellectually and even emotionally, the loneliness and hunger and delusion that drove what she did, and understanding has done for me most of what forgiveness is advertised to do. I don't carry rage daily. Rage is heavy, and she isn't worth the posture. But understanding is not a pardon, and accountability, real consequences, continued distance, isn't cruelty. It's the fence that lets the grass grow back. My relationship with my parents needed its own rebuilding. My mother carried guilt for years. She'd handed me to her sister because she trusted her, and learning what that trust had cost nearly broke her. We've talked it to the bone, and then let it rest. The truth I keep handing her is this. She failed to see something that was deliberately hidden from her by an expert at hiding it, and the day it surfaced, she believed me instantly and fought for me completely. That's not a parent who failed. That's a parent who was deceived alongside me. If you're a parent listening, the lesson isn't trust no one. The lesson is the boring, unglamorous one. Keep lines open with your kids about their bodies, about secrets, about the rule that no adult should ever ask them to hide something from you, not because you're suspicious, but because secrecy is the whole mechanism of this kind of harm. Every protective structure in my story failed at exactly one point, and that point was silence. I'm in my 30s now. I have a partner who knows all of this. I told them on our fourth date, which was too early by every rule and exactly right by mine, because I'd spent my youth in a double life, and I will not build a relationship on a curated self ever again. They listened, asked careful questions, and then asked what I wanted for dinner, and the ordinariness of that reaction told me more about our future than any vow could have. I have a small circle of friends who know. I work, I pay taxes, I have a dog who is unimpressed by all of this. My life is, by every external measure, quite ordinary, and I cannot tell you what a triumph that ordinariness is. Ordinary was the prize. Nobody tells you that when you're young and everything is dramatic, that the goal isn't a spectacular life. It's a life where your insides and outsides match closely enough that you can stop spending energy on the gap. If you're listening to this and some piece of it rhymes with your own life, maybe you're questioning your gender or your presentation. Maybe you carry a secret someone else installed in you. Maybe you're the parent or the friend or the person who's just trying to understand. Let me offer the few things I actually know, the ones I'd stake my name on. First, exploration of who you are is healthy, human, and yours, and it should happen at your pace, with your consent, in daylight. Second, any adult who medicates, reshapes, or scripts a young person in secret has committed a profound violation, no matter how warm it felt from inside, and warmth and violation are not opposites. That combination is exactly how it works. Third, if something was done to you, the question, who am I really, does not have to be answered all at once, or ever, finally. You get to run your own quiet experiments. You get to keep what fits and release what doesn't, including releasing people. Fourth, the body keeps receipts. Get real medical information from real doctors. The internet is where I started, but a doctor is where the truth about my body actually lived. And fifth, maybe most important, you are allowed to be complicated. You are allowed to be a person whose story doesn't resolve into a clean before and after. Mine doesn't. Most honest stories don't. People sometimes ask if I regret that the dress-up ever happened, whether I'd trade away those early sunny afternoons in my aunt's kitchen to have been spared everything after. I've stopped trying to answer, because it's a false arithmetic. The afternoons were real, and they were used against me. Both things are true. The thread of genuine self I found in front of that mirror at 9 was real, and it was exploited. Both things are true. What I know is that the person sitting here telling you this, whole, ordinary, self-authored, still occasionally nervous at family gatherings but present for his own life in a way I couldn't have imagined at 15, was built from all of it, the harm and the healing and the stubborn refusal to let anyone, kind or cruel, hold the pen. Your story is yours. Not the one written over you, not the one you perform for approval, not the one fear tells you to settle for. Yours. You get to write it slowly, privately, honestly, and you get to change your mind as many times as it takes. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.